The morning Rowan Mercer rode into Coldwater Bluff to sign away the last of his pride, the sky was the color of a bad bruise, purple-gray and low, the kind of sky that felt like a threat rather than weather. He didn't hurry. There was no point in hurrying to your own execution. His horse, a scarred roan gelding named Jasper, moved at a slow walk down the main street, hooves clipping the half-frozen mud in a dull, rhythmic beat. Rowan sat straight in the saddle the way his father had taught him. Back like a fence post, boy. Never let a man see you bend. But inside he was a house with the supports knocked out, standing only because the walls hadn't figured out yet that there was nothing holding them up. He was 34 years old. He had calluses on his hands thick enough to sand wood. He had buried a wife 2 winters ago, and he was still finding her handwriting on scraps of paper tucked in coat pockets and book spines. He had a daughter, 8 years old, who collected river stones and asked too many questions and still sometimes reached for her mother in the dark. And he was about to lose the only thing his family had ever owned outright. The Mercer land, 412 acres carved from the Rockies by his grandfather's bare hands, sat 7 miles east of town, bounded by Elk Creek on the north and a ridge of ponderosa pines on the south. It wasn't glamorous land. The winters were brutal. The soil in the lower pasture went boggy in spring. The south fence needed replacing every other year because the elk didn't respect borders. But it was his. It had his grandfather's sweat in it, his father's blood, literally. The old man had sliced open his palm on barbed wire stringing the east fence and made a joke about it while blood soaked through his glove. It had his own childhood, his own grief, his own daughter's footprints in the mud by the creek. And it had a debt attached to it now, a debt that had grown teeth. He tied Jasper outside the Coldwater Bank and Lending, a squat stone building that always smelled of pipe smoke and damp wool, and sat for a moment looking at the door. Someone had painted it green at some point. The paint was peeling now, curling back from the wood like something trying to get away. Smart, Rowan thought. Get out while you can. He went inside. 10. Victor Crowley was a man who had figured out early in life that the real power wasn't in owning things. It was in owning the paper that said other people owed you for things. He was 51, broad through the shoulders, with silver hair he kept oiled back from a wide forehead and a face that knew how to arrange itself into reasonable expressions at reasonable times. His suits came from Denver. His boots came from a cobbler in St. Louis. His money, or more accurately, his leverage, came from a decade of quietly buying up debt in a region where bad luck and bad weather made debt as common as dirt. He had purchased Rowan Mercer's promissory note from the original lender 8 months prior. Rowan hadn't known about the transfer until Crowley's attorney delivered a notice that the balance was being called in full, $4,200, due within 60 days. $4,200 might as well have been the moon. Rowan had spent those 60 days doing every calculation he could think of. He could sell cattle, but prices were down, and he'd need every head to get through winter. He could sell timber rights on the north acreage, but that would take months to negotiate, and months were what he didn't have. He'd approached 2 other lenders in town, hat genuinely in hand, and both had turned him away with the specific kind of careful politeness that meant someone had already gotten to them first. He knew who that someone was. Now he sat across a wide mahogany desk from Victor Crowley, who was reading something, or pretending to read something, while Rowan waited. It was a technique. Rowan recognized it. Make a man wait long enough and he starts to feel like a supplicant before he said a word. Rowan put his hat on his knee and looked at the water stain on the ceiling and waited. "Mercer," Crowley said finally, setting down his papers and folding his hands. "Thank you for coming in. Wasn't much of a choice." "There's always a choice." A thin smile. "That's what I tell people. There's always a choice. Sometimes you just don't like the options." Rowan looked at him steadily. He had promised himself he wouldn't show anger. Anger was a tool other people could use against you. "You blocked my refinancing with Hollis and with the Continental Bank." Crowley tilted his head slightly, the smile not moving. "I have relationships with various financial institutions in this county. I can't control the decisions they make. You can if you threaten to pull your accounts. Strong language. It's the accurate word." Crowley unfolded his hands and leaned back in his chair, which creaked with what seemed like satisfaction. "You're in a difficult position, Rowan. I'll be direct with you. I find that men like you appreciate directness. The note is due. You can't pay it. Foreclosure is the legal next step. And frankly, I have buyers already interested in the land. This doesn't have to be unpleasant. Something cold settled behind Rowan's sternum. You have buyers already. I like to be prepared. You planned this from the day you bought the note. Crowley's expression didn't change, which was itself a kind of answer. Rowan looked at the mahogany desk. He thought about Maisie this morning, eating her oatmeal at the kitchen table with river stones lined up beside her bowl. She'd been sorting them by color, some system only she understood, talking to herself quietly while she ate. He thought about her not understanding why they had to leave. He thought about trying to explain it. "What do you want?" he said. His voice came out flatter than he intended, which was probably better than the alternative. Crowley stood, moved to a cabinet behind his desk, and took out a bottle and 2 glasses with the smooth motion of a man who had choreographed this scene before. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into each glass and set one in front of Rowan. Rowan didn't touch it. "Sit back down," Rowan said. Crowley paused, then sat. Good. Rowan was tired of watching the man perform. "There's a woman," Crowley said. "Celeste Vale." Rowan knew the name. Everybody in Coldwater Bluff knew the name, and everybody in Coldwater Bluff knew it the way they knew the name of a street brawl or a courthouse scandal, as a story to repeat, with details adjusted depending on who was telling it. "What about her?" "She's been a thorn in my side for some time." Crowley's voice was still pleasant, conversational, the way it would be if he were discussing weather or livestock prices. "She was a schoolteacher. Good one, apparently, though that's besides the point. She took issue with certain business arrangements I had with the school board, spoke publicly about it, wrote letters to the county paper, caused a significant amount of disruption." "What kind of arrangements?" "The kind that are nobody's business but the parties involved." A slight edge, then smoothed away. The school board dismissed her. The community, most of it, sided with the board, as communities tend to do when one side has money and the other has principle. He said principle the way you'd say influenza, as a word for something unfortunate and catching. "She's been living on the margins since then. No income to speak of. She refuses to leave town, which I find admirable in a stubborn and inconvenient way. What does any of this have to do with me?" Crowley looked at him with something that might have been amusement and might have been contempt, and was probably both. "I want her married off, settled, out of the public eye and out of my business. If she's someone's wife living on a ranch 7 miles from town, her voice loses its particular reach. And frankly, a married woman in this county has fewer avenues for making trouble than a single one does." He paused. "Especially if the man she marries isn't inclined to indulge her." Rowan was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a cart went by on the street, wheels grinding against frozen mud. "You want me to marry a woman I don't know," he said, "in exchange for my debt disappearing." "I want you to marry a specific woman," Crowley said. "And yes, your debt disappears the day you say your vows. All of it. Principal, accrued interest, everything. The note is destroyed. Your ranch is yours, free and clear. And if I say no, foreclosure proceedings begin Monday." Crowley picked up his own whiskey glass. "You lose the ranch, Rowan. Your daughter loses her home. And I have 412 acres to sell to men who'll put cattle on it and won't know your grandfather's name by spring." Rowan sat very still. He hated this man. He had met people he disliked before, people he disagreed with, people who had wronged him in the ordinary ways people wrong each other. But sitting across this desk, he felt something more specific than dislike. He felt it the way you feel a cold wind, as a fact about the world that you have to deal with regardless of whether you like it. He thought about Maisie's river stones. "I want to meet her first," he said. Crowley set down his glass. "Of course." Celeste Vale was living in 2 rooms above the hardware store, which she was getting rent-free in exchange for keeping the store's ledgers, a transaction she had negotiated herself, and which she considered fair, even if both parties knew the hardware store owner was doing her a kindness he couldn't entirely afford. She was 28. She had dark hair that she kept in a practical braid because she had learned, roughly around age 22, that the world took her more seriously when she looked like she wasn't trying to be decorative. She had a face that was striking rather than soft, strong jaw, direct eyes, a mouth that people read as stubborn even when she was simply thinking. She had grown up in Laramie, come to Coldwater Bluff 4 years ago for the teaching position, and stayed through a sequence of events she couldn't quite identify as choices, so much as the accumulation of circumstances that happened while she was busy fighting other things. She was behind the counter of the hardware store when Rowan Mercer walked in. He was a tall man, taller than she'd expected, though she wasn't sure what she'd expected. She knew who he was the way she knew most people in town, generally from a distance, through the lens of other people's commentary. Mercer? The widower out on Elk Creek. Quiet man. Good cattleman, they say. Keeps to himself since Eleanor died. He stopped just inside the door, holding his hat in both hands, and looked around the store with the particular expression of a man who has been told to do something he's not sure he can actually do. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He looked at her. She had the sensation of being assessed, though not in the way that usually made her want to take a step back. More like the way you'd look at a situation you were trying to understand. "Miss Vale," he said, "I appreciate you seeing me. Mr. Crowley arranged this meeting." She said it plainly, without heat or apology. "I know why you're here." He blinked. "He told you?" "He came himself 2 days ago. He told me you were in debt and that this arrangement would satisfy it. He seemed to expect me to be grateful for the opportunity." She watched Rowan's jaw tighten slightly. "He also strongly implied that if I refused, he had several creative ways to make my remaining time in Coldwater Bluff considerably more unpleasant. He threatened you." He suggested. "Crowley doesn't threaten directly. He does that. He doesn't have to. The implication is enough." She came around the counter and gestured toward the 2 chairs by the stove that the hardware store owner used for his own sitting. "Will you sit?" He sat. She sat across from him and looked at him steadily and waited, which was something she was good at. "I want to be honest with you," Rowan said. "I'd appreciate that. I don't want to be sitting here. I don't want any part of this. If I could find another way—" He stopped, pressed his thumb into the brim of his hat. "I have a daughter. She's 8. The ranch is everything she has left of her mother, and I can't—" Another stop. He was a man who chose his words carefully, she thought, because he'd learned that too many words could be held against you. "I can't let Crowley take it from her." Celeste looked at the stove for a moment. The fire inside it was burning low. "Tell me about the debt." He told her. She listened without interrupting, and as he talked, she tracked the numbers in her head. Not because she was doubting him, but because she had learned that numbers told a different story than words did, and the difference between those stories was often where the real problem lived. When he finished, she asked, "Did you read the original promissory note before you signed it?" He shifted in the chair. "My wife handled most of the paperwork. She was better with that kind of thing." "And after she died?" "I found the documents, but I'm not a reading man, Miss Vale. I manage the land, the animals, the seasons. Contracts and legal language aren't—" He stopped again, and she could see the specific discomfort of a competent person admitting a gap in their competence. It was a particular kind of pain, that one. She knew it. "I understand," she said. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," he said, a quick clarification, like he was afraid she'd think he wanted rescuing. "I'm asking you to—" He put his hat on his knee and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "I'm asking you to decide if you can live on a ranch with a man who can't offer you anything except a roof and his word that he won't make your life small." Celeste was quiet. It was not a romantic offer. It was not even a kind offer, really. It was a transaction wrapped in a small and unusual amount of honesty, which was more than she'd gotten from most people lately. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me." "I won't be your servant. I'll help with the ranch because I'm not a woman who sits still, and because I'd rather earn my keep than accept charity. But I won't cook and clean and disappear into that house." "All right. I want access to every document relating to the debt, every contract, every letter, every note. I want to read all of it." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I was a school teacher, and before that, I was a girl who learned to read when I was 4 years old and never stopped. And because something in the numbers you described doesn't add up, and I want to know why." A long pause. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the hardware store's front window in its frame. "All right," he said again. His voice was careful. "And I won't pretend with you," she said. "I won't put on a face for the town or play the blushing wife. We both know what this is. I'll be respectful, and I expect the same back." "That's fair." She looked at him for a moment longer. This quiet, grief-worn man holding his hat on his knee, offering her nothing and asking the same in return. "All right, Mr. Mercer," she said, "let's save your ranch." They were married on a Thursday morning in October, which Celeste would later remember as the coldest morning of her life, and not because of the temperature. The courthouse in Coldwater Bluff was a sandstone building that smelled of old paper, and something else, mildew maybe, or the particular staleness of rooms where people sat and waited for the state to make decisions about their lives. Judge Harlan Purvis, who was 60 years old and treated every legal proceeding as a minor inconvenience between himself and his lunch, performed the ceremony with the enthusiasm of a man reading a tax form aloud. There were witnesses. Crowley was there, naturally, standing to one side in his good suit, watching with the specific satisfaction of a man who has gotten exactly what he wanted and isn't trying particularly hard to hide it. He had brought his attorney, a thin, precise man named Belford, who kept taking notes in a small leather book. Why you'd take notes at someone else's wedding was not a question Celeste let herself examine too closely. There were also a handful of townspeople, which Celeste hadn't expected and which she suspected Crowley had arranged. They stood near the back of the clerk's office where the ceremony was being performed, not quite guests and not quite audience, wearing expressions that ranged from curious to uncomfortable to something that Celeste recognized with a dull twist in her chest as pitying. She was wearing the cleanest dress she owned, dark blue wool, high collar, nothing that could be called festive. She had not done anything particular with her hair. She had not carried flowers. She had considered, for about 30 seconds, whether she should make some gesture toward ceremony, and then decided that gesturing at something she didn't feel was precisely the kind of dishonesty she had spent years trying to cut out of her life. Rowan was wearing a dark coat that was clean but not new, and boots that had been polished recently. He had shaved. That was all she could really say about how he looked. He stood beside her with the wooden, upright posture of a man enduring something. "Do you, Rowan James Mercer, take this woman?" "I do," Rowan said. He said it the way you'd confirm an appointment, not unkind, just matter of fact. Judge Purvis blinked, apparently surprised to have a groom who didn't wait for the full question. He looked at Celeste. "Do you, Celeste Anvale, take this man?" She looked at the judge. She looked, for one involuntary moment, at the smug set of Crowley's jaw from across the room. She thought about the 2 rooms above the hardware store. She thought about the conversation by the stove and the man who had said, "I'm asking you to decide if you can live on a ranch with a man who can't offer you anything except a roof and his word." It was not enough. It was also, she was aware, more than she currently had. "I do," she said. The ring was plain silver, size slightly too large. Rowan slid it on her finger and looked at her hand for a moment, then let go. "I now pronounce you—" There was, traditionally, a kiss. Rowan looked at her. There was something in his face that she couldn't name exactly. Not reluctance, not disgust, but a kind of profound discomfort. The expression of a man who was realizing all at once that this was, in fact, a real thing that was happening to a real person. "You don't have to," she said quietly. Only he could hear it. He leaned forward and pressed his lips briefly against her cheek. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds and was about as romantic as a handshake, but it was, she thought, at least not performative. He wasn't pretending. He was just doing the required thing, carefully, without cruelty. Crowley began to clap, slow and deliberate, from across the room. It was one of the most unpleasant sounds Celeste had ever heard. She turned to face him. She was not sure what her expression was doing, but based on the way Belford, the attorney, took a small step back, it was probably not pleasant. Crowley smiled at her. "Congratulations, Mrs. Mercer," he said. "I do hope you'll be happy." Celeste looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Crowley," she said, "I'd like a copy of every document related to my husband's debt. The original note, the transfer paperwork, the terms." She kept her voice very level. "I'll need them delivered to the ranch by end of week." Crowley's smile didn't disappear, but it changed shape in some way that was hard to pin down. "Of course," he said. "Whatever helps you settle in." "Thank you." She turned away from him to Rowan. Rowan was looking at her with an expression she would later learn was characteristic of him when something surprised him. A stillness, a recalibration, like an animal that has heard an unexpected sound and is deciding what to do about it. "Ready?" she said. He put on his hat. "Let's go home," he said. It didn't sound warm. It didn't sound cold either. It sounded like the beginning of something neither of them had chosen, and both of them were going to have to figure out how to survive. Outside, the sky was that same bruised purple-gray it had been all week, and the wind was picking up off the mountains. Celeste pulled her coat tighter and walked beside Rowan Mercer, her husband, in the legal and specific sense, toward the wagon that would take them to a ranch she had never seen, to a home that was not yet hers. Behind them, she heard Crowley laugh at something his attorney said. She filed the sound away. She had a feeling she was going to need to remember it. Maisie Mercer was sitting on the top rail of the corral fence when the wagon came up the road. She had been told there would be a new person coming to live at the ranch. Her father had told her this with the same careful, factual tone he used for things he wasn't sure how to explain. The same tone he had used when he explained that her mother wasn't coming back, and that the calf born in February hadn't made it, and that some winters were just harder than others. He had said, "There's a woman named Celeste who is going to come live with us. She'll have her own room and she'll help around the ranch. She's had a hard time of it lately, and we're going to be kind to her." Maisie had considered this and asked, "Is she going to be my new mother?" Her father had looked at the window for a moment and said, "I don't know yet, Bug," which was more honest than most adults would have been, Maisie thought, and she appreciated it even if it wasn't especially satisfying as an answer. Now she watched the wagon come up the road with the particular calculating attention of a child who has learned that adults don't always tell you the important things about situations, so you have to figure them out yourself. Her father was driving. The woman beside him was sitting straight, not stiff, but upright, looking at the ranch with her eyes moving over it systematically, the way you'd look at something you were trying to understand. The wagon stopped. Her father climbed down and came around to offer a hand, which the woman took without making a fuss about it. Not performance of delicacy, just practical acceptance of the step being high. Then the woman looked up and saw Maisie on the fence. Maisie looked back. They studied each other. "You must be Maisie," the woman said. "You must be Celeste," Maisie said. A pause. Something shifted in the woman's face, not quite a smile, but an adjustment in the direction of one. "I must be," Celeste said. "Do you know anything about horses?" Celeste glanced at the corral, where the roan and the two workhorses stood watching the newcomer with the disinterested caution of animals who had learned that new people meant uncertain things. "I know how to ride. I know basic care. I'm not an expert." "Do you like horses?" "I respect them." Maisie thought about that. Respect was different from like. Respect was, in some ways, more interesting. "Okay," she said, and climbed down from the fence. Rowan, watching this exchange, looked like a man trying to understand what had just happened and not quite succeeding. The ranch house was larger than Celeste had expected, large in the way of frontier houses, meaning functional rather than spacious, but more rooms than she'd imagined, with the additions that came from a family that had been in one place long enough to need more space for living. The main room was clean but worn. A scarred plank table, 2 chairs, a reading rocker by the window that still had a small pile of mending in the basket beside it that looked like it had been sitting there long enough to become invisible. Eleanor's mending. Celeste recognized it the way she recognized grief, not personally, but by its shape. She was shown to a room at the back of the house. It had a narrow window looking south, a plain iron bedstead, a washstand, a small chest of drawers. It had been recently aired. She could smell the faint cold from the window having been opened. And someone had put a clean blanket on the bed that was folded with excessive neatness. The neatness of someone who was trying to do right by a situation they weren't sure about. She set her bag down on the floor and looked around the room. It was not much. It was, however, entirely hers in a way the 2 rooms above the hardware store had never quite been, because those rooms had been borrowed and everyone had known it, including her. She unpacked her things in the systematic way she did everything. Books first, because they made a place feel inhabited. Then clothes, then the small locked tin box that held her documents, her teaching certificates, her letters of reference from the years before the school board dismissed her, the copies she had made of every piece of correspondence relating to that situation, because she had known, even then, that documentation was the only real protection an unprotected woman had. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for exactly the amount of time it took to take 3 slow breaths, to acknowledge that she was scared. Not of Rowan Mercer. Not, precisely, of this place. Scared of what happened if this didn't work. Scared of what Crowley was capable of doing to a woman who had now, by marrying Rowan, given him exactly what he wanted, which meant she had also placed herself squarely in the middle of whatever he might decide to do next. 3 breaths. She was done with it. She picked up her coat and went to find the kitchen. Dinner that first night was a negotiation that nobody announced as won. Maisie had set the table, 3 places she'd done that herself without being asked, which Rowan noticed and which meant something about what the child wanted from this situation. Rowan had made something with salt pork and potatoes that was functional food in the specific way of a man who ate to stay alive, rather than to enjoy the process. Celeste ate it without comment. It wasn't bad. It wasn't good. It was fuel. Do you read? Maisie asked Celeste. I was a teacher, Celeste said. So yes. Do you read out loud? Maisie, Rowan said, with a tone that meant don't make demands. It's all right, Celeste said. Yes, I read out loud. Maisie looked at her father with an expression that said, see? Then she looked at Celeste with an expression that said, good. Then she went back to her potatoes. Rowan poured himself another cup of coffee and looked at the table and said nothing. After dinner, when Maisie had gone to bed, Celeste sat at the table and Rowan sat across from her, and they looked at each other in the lamplight with the full awkwardness of 2 strangers who were now, legally, family. The documents, Celeste said. I meant what I said to Crowley. I want to see everything. You think there's something wrong with them? I think there might be. Some of what you told me, the numbers don't fit how promissory notes usually work. The way the interest accrued, the conditions of transfer. It doesn't fit. What would it mean if you're right? Celeste looked at the lamp. I don't know yet. Possibly nothing. Possibly the note is simply unfavorable and Crowley is simply ruthless, which is bad, but not illegal. Possibly something else. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like the ocean, which Celeste had never actually heard but imagined as something like this. Why are you doing this? He said. Not hostile, genuinely asking. She looked at him. Doing what? Looking for a fight you might not win. A pause. You already have what you came for, the roof, the terms you set. I'm not going to make your life small. I told you that and I meant it. You don't have to... He stopped. You don't have to fix anything. Celeste considered the question the way she considered most questions. Seriously, from all sides, without rushing to the answer she wanted to give. I don't like people who do what Crowley does, she said finally. I've spent 4 years watching him do it to other people and not being in a position to do much about it except write letters that got me fired and whisper in rooms where nobody wanted to listen. And now I'm in a specific position. I have access to documents. I have time. She looked at Rowan directly. I don't do things halfway. He looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up his coffee cup and said, Crowley's going to make trouble. He was always going to make trouble, she said. The question is whether we're ready for it. He sent you here to be sidelined. Yes. She met his eyes. He miscalculated. Something shifted in Rowan's expression. That stillness again, that recalibration. This time it lasted longer, and when it resolved, it wasn't into neutrality. It was into something that was, if not warmth exactly, at least the absence of walls. All right, Celeste, he said. He said her name like he was testing the weight of it. She nodded once. I'll need a lamp in my room that burns past midnight. He got up from the table and went to the cabinet and took out an extra lamp and set it on the table in front of her without comment. She looked at it. Then she looked at this quiet, difficult man who had agreed to terms he didn't fully understand with a woman he didn't know, who had brought her to a home that still had another woman's mending in the basket, who had promised her a roof and his word, and was now, apparently, keeping both. She thought, this might actually be salvageable. She thought, don't get ahead of yourself. She took the lamp and went to her room to start reading. The documents arrived on Friday, delivered by Belford, the attorney, in a leather satchel that he handed over at the front door without coming inside, which told Celeste something about the message Crowley was trying to send. I'm complying, but don't mistake compliance for respect. She took the satchel, thanked Belford with precisely the neutrality the moment deserved, and closed the door. She spread everything across the kitchen table that evening while Rowan was finishing the late feeding and Maisie was doing her arithmetic lessons by the lamp in the main room. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, and the kitchen was cold enough that she could see her breath on the first few minutes, but she didn't get up to add wood. She was reading. The original promissory note was 4 pages, handwritten in the dense legal cursive of the previous century, with attached schedules of payment terms and interest calculations that had been typed on a machine with a sticking letter E. Every E sat slightly lower than the other letters, a small defect that ran through the whole document like a fault line. The transfer paperwork from the original lender to Crowley's holding company was 2 pages. There was a demand letter, 2 follow-up letters, the notice of default. Standard architecture of financial predation, she thought. She had seen the shape of it before, in smaller forms. She read everything twice. Then she went back to the original note and read it a 3rd time, slowly, paying particular attention to Section 4, Paragraph 2, Subsection C. Rowan came in from outside, bringing cold air and the smell of hay with him, and stopped when he saw the papers spread across his kitchen table. Sorry, Celeste said, not looking up. I'll clear it before breakfast. It's fine. He hung his coat on the peg by the door and came to look over her shoulder, not reading. She doubted he could parse the legal language, but looking at the volume of paper the way you'd look at bad weather coming across a plain. Anything? Maybe. She tapped the original note with one finger. This language here, in subsection C, the condition attached to the transfer clause. What does it mean? I'm not entirely sure yet. That's the problem. She sat back and rubbed her eyes. I need to find someone who knows contract law, not just general practice, specifically debt instruments and property liens. Rowan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which meant he was taking this seriously rather than humoring her, which she appreciated. There's an attorney in town, Morrison. He handled the deed when I bought the South Pasture edition. Is he Crowley's man? A pause. I don't think so. He's cautious. He doesn't get involved in things if he can help it. Cautious men are hard to read, she said. They can mean they're careful, or they can mean they've calculated which way the wind blows and decided to stay out of it. That's accurate, Rowan said. She looked at him. He was looking at the papers with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not frustration exactly, more like the face of a man confronting the specific humiliation of a domain in which he knows he doesn't have the right tools. It was an uncomfortable look to witness on a person who was clearly competent in most things. She had the impulse to say something dismissive about it. It's just reading. It's not complicated. And recognize that impulse as uncharitable and let it go. The numbers you gave me the day we met, she said instead. The original loan amount, was that the full number, or were there fees folded into it? He thought about it. Eleanor handled the signing. He stopped. She said there were some fees, processing. I don't know the amount. I need to find those, Celeste said. If the original principal was lower than what appeared in the note, that changes the interest calculations. It might change how the default was characterized. She looked at him directly. I'm not promising anything. I might be looking at nothing, but something in this document doesn't feel clean. Crowley's never clean, Rowan said. Flat. Not angry, just factual. The way you'd state that winter was cold or that elk didn't respect fences. No, she said, but there's a difference between doing things badly and doing things illegally. I want to know which one this is. Maisie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her nightgown, carrying her arithmetic slate and looking at the papers on the table with the unself-conscious curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that she wasn't supposed to be interested in adult problems. What are all those? Documents, Celeste said. What kind? The kind that tell you what people agreed to and whether they're keeping their agreements. Maisie considered this. Are people keeping their agreements? That's what I'm trying to find out. The child looked at the papers for another moment, then looked at Celeste with a directness that was, Celeste had quickly learned, simply her default expression. Not rudeness, just an absence of the social softening that adults performed for each other. My mother kept all her papers in a box under the bed. Maisie said. In her room. Papa hasn't moved it. The kitchen was very quiet. Rowan's face did something complicated and still at the same time, like a pond surface disturbed by a stone and trying to settle. Maisie, he said quietly. Bed. I was just saying, I heard you. Thank you. Bed. Maisie gave her father a look that was not defiance but was adjacent to it, then looked at Celeste once more with an expression that meant something. Celeste wasn't sure yet what. The child retreated down the hallway. Rowan stared at the table. He picked up his coffee cup, and it was empty, and he set it down again. I won't touch anything that was Eleanor's, Celeste said carefully. If there are documents in that box, I won't ask you to go through them. Not for this. He was quiet for a moment. She might have kept the original loan paperwork. His voice was careful in a different way. Not controlled, but handled, the way you'd handle something fragile that you weren't sure would hold together. She kept everything. She said you never knew when a piece of paper would matter. She was right, Celeste said. Another silence. The fire in the stove had gone completely to ash. The kitchen was cold enough now that it was uncomfortable, but neither of them moved. I'll look in the morning, Rowan said finally, before the feeding. Celeste nodded. She started gathering the papers back into the satchel so the table would be clear for breakfast, and she did it without ceremony, without filling the silence with words it didn't need. Rowan got up, added wood to the stove without being asked, and left without saying anything else. She sat for a while after he left and listened to the pines in the wind, and thought about a woman she had never met who kept her papers in a box and who had known, apparently, that the paper would matter. She thought, Eleanor Mercer was smarter than her husband gave himself credit for being, or maybe exactly as smart as he knew she was. And that's why her absence left such a specific shape in every room of this house. She didn't say it to anyone, she just thought it and put it away and went to bed. The lamp burned past midnight. The frost on the window was thick by morning. Neither of these things was unusual anymore. She was beginning to know the shape of the ranch's rhythms, the way you know the rhythms of a place you've committed to paying attention to. The night sounds. The particular creak of the house settling against cold. The sound of Rowan's boots on the floor before dawn, not loud, but deliberate. The sound of a man who got up when the day required it, regardless of how the night had gone. She was already in his kitchen when he came through on his way to the barn. He stopped, which had been his habit the first few mornings, surprised at finding her already there, and now, by the end of the first week, had become something else. Not exactly expectation, more like acknowledgement, a small recalibration. Coffee's on, she said. I can see that. He poured himself a cup and stood at the counter drinking it, the way he did everything in those early mornings, efficiently, without conversation, in the particular silence of a person who treats the first hour of the day as something to endure before the world asks things of him. She had decided not to take the silence personally, which had been a decision she'd had to make consciously and more than once. He set down his cup and went outside, and 10 minutes later came back and set a wooden box on the table beside her coffee. Eleanor's papers, he said. Then he went back outside. Celeste looked at the box. It was plain pine, with a simple latch, the kind of box you could buy at any general store, worn smooth at the corners from handling. Someone had scratched initials into the lid, E.A.M. Eleanor Ann Mercer, probably, or whoever she had been before she was a Mercer. She opened it. Inside, in neat bundles held together with kitchen string, were the papers of a life, personal and practical and important in the way that the papers of a competent, careful person are important. Letters, receipts, deeds. And yes, near the bottom, a folded sheaf that turned out to be the original paperwork from the loan, including the application. A page of handwritten fee calculations. And whoosh! This was what made Celeste sit forward. A letter from the original lender confirming the terms and noting, in a sentence that she read 3 times to be certain she was reading it correctly, that the standard transfer clause had been modified at the borrower's request. Modified. At the borrower's request. She read the fee calculations. She added numbers in the margin of a scrap paper she found in her pocket. She checked them again. The original principal was lower than the amount stated in the transferred note. Not by much. Not dramatically. By $312. But in the context of how the interest had been calculated, In the context of the transfer clause and its conditions, $312 was not just $312. It was the thread you pulled that unraveled the shape of the whole thing. She sat at the kitchen table with Eleanor Mercer's papers and thought about what she was looking at and what she would need to prove it, and whether she was right or only wanted to be right, which were two different states that she had spent enough of her life confusing to know how important it was to distinguish between them. When Rowan came back in at mid-morning, she was still at the table. "You were right," she said. He stopped in the doorway. "About what, specifically?" "About something being wrong." She turned the fee sheet toward him and pointed to the relevant line. The original loan principal was smaller than what appeared in the transferred note. The difference isn't enormous, but it was enough to change how the default threshold was calculated. If I'm reading the transfer clause correctly, she picked up the note and found the page. The conditions under which Crowley was permitted to call the debt in full weren't actually met. Not legally. Rowan crossed to the table and looked at the documents, and she watched his face go through the stages of a man hearing something he'd hoped to hear and was afraid to believe. What does that mean? It means the foreclosure notice may have been premature. It means the legal basis for the demand letter may be shaky. She looked at him. It means we might have something. Might, he said. Not skeptical. Careful. Might, she confirmed. I need someone who knows property law. What I know is general, enough to see the shape of the problem, not enough to be certain I'm right about the specifics. We need Morrison. He was quiet for a moment, thinking, she had learned, not stalling. Rowan Mercer's silences were computational, not evasive. She had adjusted to them. Morrison is cautious, he said again. Yes. He's going to want to know where this is going before he commits to anything. Then we go in knowing what we're asking for, Celeste said. Not commitment, just an opinion, an interpretation of a clause. He can give us that much without sticking his neck out. Rowan looked at her. You've been thinking about this. I've been awake since 4, she said. Yes. Something that was almost a smile moved through his expression and resolved before it fully arrived. All right. He looked at the box on the table. She kept everything. It wasn't exactly addressed to Celeste, but she answered anyway. She was smart. I know she was. He picked up the box and held it for a moment with both hands, that controlled stillness on his face again, and then set it back on the table carefully. I'll ride into town this afternoon. See if Morrison will meet with us. I'll go with you. He looked at her. It's my marriage, she said. It's my name on these papers now, too. She paused. And I can explain what I found better than you can. He considered this for exactly as long as it took to recognize it was true. Fine, he said, after lunch. The ride into town was cold and mostly quiet, which was becoming their default. Not uncomfortable silence, just the silence of two people who had not yet found the particular frequency on which they could talk easily, and who had tacitly agreed not to force it. The wagon road wound through a stand of bare-branched aspens, and then climbed slightly before dropping into the valley, where Coldwater Bluff sat along its creek. Celeste looked at the mountains east of town, white above the tree line, and thought about how different this landscape was from Laramie, and how quickly a person could absorb the specifics of a new place when they had reason to pay attention. Maisie had asked to come. Rowan had said no, and then Maisie had given him a look of such precise disappointment that he'd said next time, which Celeste had noted because it implied he was thinking in terms of next times, which implied he was thinking of this, whatever this was, as ongoing rather than temporary. Small things. She noticed small things. It was a habit she couldn't quite break, and most of the time she didn't try. Morrison's office was on the second floor of the building above the barber shop, accessible by an exterior staircase that squeaked aggressively on every step. Morrison himself was a compact man in his mid-50s with wire spectacles and the careful manner of someone who had made a professional habit of withholding reactions until he had enough information to justify them. He looked at Rowan when they came in, then at Celeste, then at the satchel she was carrying, and said nothing for a moment except, "Sit down." They sat. Morrison sat behind his desk and folded his hands. "I've heard you married," he said to Rowan. "Not congratulations, not judgment, just acknowledgement." "We married," Rowan said. He didn't say she's my wife or any of the formulations that would have been expected. He said we married, which put Celeste in the sentence as an equal participant rather than an object of action, and which she noticed and did not comment on. "I need an interpretation," Celeste said. She opened the satchel and found the relevant documents and set them on the desk in the specific order she'd decided on during the ride. Transfer clause, subsection C, and the fee schedule from the original application. She slid them across. Morrison looked at the papers without touching them for a moment, then picked up the original note. He read. He turned a page. He picked up the fee schedule. He read that too, and she saw him stop at the same line she had stopped at and saw his jaw shift slightly. He set everything down and looked at her. "Where did you find the original application?" "In documents belonging to Mrs. Mercer. The first Mrs. Mercer," Celeste said. "She kept everything." A pause. Morrison looked at his hands, then back at the documents. "The principal discrepancy you're seeing?" "Yes." "And the modified transfer clause?" "Yes." "You think that affects when and whether Crowley was entitled to call the debt?" "I think it's possible. I'm not a lawyer." "That's why I'm here." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. He had the specific quality of a careful man looking at something he wished he hadn't been shown and now couldn't unknow. Celeste had seen that expression before and knew it could go several ways. "This is Crowley's paper," Morrison said. Flat statement. "Yes," Rowan said. Another pause. Celeste watched Morrison and didn't say anything because she had learned that pressure at the wrong moment closed doors faster than silence did. "What you're describing," Morrison said slowly, "if the discrepancy holds up and the transfer clause language means what you think it means, and I'm not saying it does, I'm saying if, then the demand notice was premature. The debt was not legally callable at the time Crowley called it." He stopped. "And if you married in response to a debt that wasn't legally callable, then the terms of that arrangement were based on a misrepresentation," Celeste said. Morrison looked at her. She had the feeling she was being reassessed in real time, which was something she'd experienced before and had stopped finding uncomfortable. Being underestimated was its own kind of advantage. "I need time with these documents," Morrison said. "I'm not committing to anything. I'm looking and I'm telling you what I find, and then you decide what you want to do about it." "That's all we're asking," Celeste said. "You understand that if you pursue this, if there's something genuinely wrong here and you try to use it, Crowley is going to come down on you with everything he has." "He was already going to do that," Rowan said. "He arranged this marriage to sideline my wife. He bought my debt specifically to take my land. He's been working toward this for a year. We're not choosing a fight. We're already in one." Morrison looked at Rowan for a moment, then at Celeste, then back at the papers. He picked up the original note again and held it with the focused attention of a man who has decided to commit to something, even if it's just the commitment to look. "Come back Thursday," he said. "I'll have something for you." They were back on the wagon and out of town before Celeste said anything. She waited until the aspens closed around them and the town was a smear of wood smoke and lamplight behind them. "He's going to help us," she said. Rowan was looking at the road. "You can't know that." He picked the note back up after he said come back Thursday. He picked it back up and started reading again. He didn't put it away. She felt the cold air on her face and the particular quality of satisfaction that came from reading a situation correctly. He's angry about this. He's been watching Crowley operate in this county for a decade and he hasn't had cause to do anything about it. We just gave him cause. Rowan drove in silence for a moment, then, "You're very good at reading people. It was useful in a classroom." "I imagine." A pause. The aspens thinned and opened up and the mountains came back into view, the sky above them purple dark at the edges, the afternoon running short the way it did this time of year. "What happens if we're right?" Rowan said. "If Morrison confirms the note was—" "We go to court," Celeste said. "We challenge the debt. We challenge the foreclosure. We put everything Crowley did on the table in front of a judge. Crowley owns half the people in this county. He owns their fear," she said. "That's different from owning people. Fear runs out when people see that the thing they were afraid of can be beaten." She looked at the mountains. "He picked the wrong woman to try to sideline." Rowan looked at her. She became aware of being looked at and turned to meet it. He was doing that recalibration thing again, that stillness, but it was slower this time and resolved into something different than it had before. Not the absence of walls exactly, but the walls doing something other than keeping her out. "I need to apologize to you," he said. She blinked. "For what?" "For not reading the documents myself, for not fighting back from the beginning, for letting it get to where a woman I don't know had to come and live in my house because I couldn't figure out my own paperwork." He looked back at the road. Eleanor would have seen this. She saw everything. After she died, I should have learned. I kept telling myself I'd get to it. Celeste was quiet for a moment. "Your wife died," she said. "You had a child and a ranch and a grief that apparently nobody in this town was much help with. You didn't get to the paperwork." She paused. "That's not a character flaw. That's just what grief looks like." He didn't say anything. "And for what it's worth," she said, "you gave me access to everything without hesitating. You let me open Eleanor's box. You drove into town today because I said to." She looked at him. "You trusted a stranger." "You're not exactly a stranger anymore," he said. It came out roughly, like it hadn't quite been meant to. "No," she agreed. "Not exactly." The wagon went on. Smoke from the ranch chimney was visible now, and the light in the main window, which meant Maisie had lit the lamp, which meant Maisie was sitting at the table with her stones or her slate, waiting for them to come back the way children waited, with a patience that was actually just the absence of any alternative, which looked like patience from the outside but felt like faith from the inside. Celeste thought about that. She thought about a child who had put 3 places at the table on the first night without being asked. She thought about Maisie saying my mother kept all her papers in a box, said with the specific casualness of a child who is trying to be helpful and doesn't fully understand that some kinds of help are also a form of grief. She thought about what it meant to be in a house where a woman had been and was no longer, and to be something other than that woman, but also now living inside the shape of her absence. It wasn't simple. Celeste hadn't expected it to be simple, but there was a note on the table with a principal discrepancy of $312. And there was a lawyer in town who was reading it right now. And there was a man driving this wagon who had said, "You're not exactly a stranger anymore," in a voice that sounded like something coming loose that had been held too tight for too long. Not simple, but maybe workable. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold and looked at the smoke coming from the chimney and thought, "That's mine too now, isn't it? That smoke, that light." It was a strange feeling, not comfortable yet. But there, the town had not been kind. In the 2 weeks since her arrival at Mercer Ranch, Celeste had ridden in twice on her own errands, to the general store, once to the post office. And she had felt the specific quality of a small town's collective attention on her back, the way whispers worked in a place like Coldwater Bluff. Not loud enough to hear directly, but present as weather. Mrs. Garfield at the post office had been cool in a way that stopped just short of rude, the kind of cool that came from a social calculation. The men at the general store had been too jovial, overperforming friendliness in a way that felt more like mockery than welcome. On the second trip, she had passed Hector Briggs, who ran the feed operation and who she knew had extended the Mercer's credit twice in the past year, and he had nodded at her with an expression she couldn't categorize, not hostile but watchful, like a man waiting to see which direction something would break. She understood it. She had been a spectacle in this town before she married Rowan, and she was a different kind of spectacle now. The woman who had made trouble for the school board, the woman Crowley had managed so cleverly, or so the story went. The disgraced school teacher turned convenient wife, put away on a ranch where she couldn't bother anyone anymore. That was the story Crowley had written for her. She was aware of it. She had no intention of living inside it. On the Thursday, they went back to Morrison's office. The attorney was already at his desk when they came in, and there was a second sheet of paper beside the documents. His own notes, dense with annotations in a small, precise hand. He looked up. "Close the door," he said. Rowan closed the door. "Sit down," Morrison said. "Both of you." They sat. Morrison picked up his notes and then put them down again, like a man deciding how to begin. "The transfer clause," he said. "Subsection C, the modification you found." He looked at Celeste. "You were right. The conditions under which a transferred note could be called in full required the original lender's written confirmation. Crowley's company did not obtain that confirmation. They obtained something that resembles it, but on close reading, the document they used was a form letter. It doesn't meet the specific requirements of the modified clause. The kitchen was... No, they were in Morrison's office, but it had the same feeling as the kitchen, that particular stillness that came before something important settled into place. So the demand was improper, Celeste said. The demand was premature at minimum and arguably invalid, Morrison said, which means the default notice was built on a demand that shouldn't have been made yet. He paused. It also means the marriage arrangement was coerced under false pretenses, Celeste said. Crowley told my husband the debt was legally callable. It wasn't. Everything that followed, the arrangement he proposed, the pressure he applied, was based on a legal situation he either manufactured through incompetence or created deliberately. Yes, Morrison said. He looked at Rowan. Do you understand what this means in practical terms? Tell me, Rowan said. It means you have grounds to challenge the note, to argue the debt was never properly in default, to potentially have the entire foreclosure action voided. Morrison took off his spectacles and set them on his desk. It also means if Crowley knew about the clause deficiency, and given how carefully he operates, I find it very difficult to believe he didn't. Then we are looking at deliberate fraud, not a mistake, a scheme. The words sat in the room. Rowan's face was doing something contained and deliberate that Celeste had come to recognize as what anger looked like on a man who had decided long ago that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. His jaw was tight. His hands were flat on his knees. What do we do? He said. His voice was perfectly level. That levelness was its own kind of intensity. Morrison put his spectacles back on. He looked like a man who had spent 50 years being cautious and was now, in the space of 1 week, deciding to stop. We build a case, he said. We document everything. We go to the district court. He looked at Celeste. And you need to keep looking at those documents, everything you can find, because fraud needs to be demonstrated, not just implied, and the more you can show, the less room Crowley has to maneuver. I'll keep looking, she said. Good. Morrison's voice was dry. And I'd suggest you both be very careful between now and when we file, because when Crowley realizes where this is heading, he will not be polite about it. Celeste looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at Celeste. Neither of them said anything about the fact that they had already accepted that Crowley was not going to be polite. They had accepted it the night they sat across the kitchen table with a lamp burning, and something about the shape of the problem coming into focus, without either of them naming it quite that way. What they had now was not a plan yet, but it was the bones of one. And on the ranch, 7 miles out of town, with the mountains at their backs, and Eleanor Mercer's papers in a pine box on the kitchen table, and a lamp that burned past midnight, they had something to build on. It wasn't comfort. It wasn't safety. It wasn't even certainty. But for two people who had started with nothing, it was a beginning that neither of them had expected, and both of them, separately, quietly, without saying it to each other, recognized as something worth fighting to keep. Morrison filed the preliminary challenge on a Monday, which meant by Tuesday afternoon Victor Crowley knew about it. Celeste had expected the response to be fast. She hadn't expected it to be quite that fast, and the speed itself told her something. That Crowley had people watching the courthouse, or watching Morrison's office, or both. That he had built a system of information that functioned like a nervous system for the town, carrying signals back to the center the moment anything moved against him. That he had been expecting something, which meant he had known, on some level, that the documents had a flaw in them, which confirmed what Morrison had suspected. Crowley hadn't made a mistake. He had made a calculation. The first thing that happened was the feed supply. Hector Briggs came out to the ranch on Tuesday evening, drove out himself rather than sending a hand, which meant he was uncomfortable enough about this that he wanted to deliver it in person rather than write it down. He stood at the door holding his hat in both hands, which was the same posture Rowan had used walking into Crowley's bank, and Celeste, who answered the door, recognized it immediately as the posture of a man who was about to say something he didn't want to say. "Mr. Briggs," she said. "Mrs. Mercer." He looked past her briefly, then back. "Is Rowan in?" "He's finishing up at the barn. Come inside." He came in reluctantly, stood near the door rather than sitting, and turned his hat in his hands while Celeste poured him coffee he hadn't asked for and set it on the table. Rowan came in 5 minutes later, read Briggs's posture in about 2 seconds, and sat down without taking off his coat. "What is it?" Briggs set his hat on the table, which meant this was going to take a minute. "Rowan, I've been extending you credit for 3 years. You've always settled up by spring, and I've never had cause to worry about it. But Crowley came to see me this morning. Briggs looked at his coffee cup. He was a large man with a red face and a general air of someone who preferred uncomplicated things and had wandered into something that was not uncomplicated. He called in a note I have with his lending company. Note I took out 4 years ago to expand the warehouse. He's calling it in full, within 30 days. Silence. He told you to cut off our credit, Rowan said. He didn't tell me. He didn't say your name. Briggs had the grace to look ashamed of the distinction. He called in the note, and I don't have 30 days worth of cash, so I'm going to need to call in what I'm owed. He looked up. I'm sorry, Rowan. I've got my own family. Celeste looked at Briggs. She was not angry at him, not truly. She understood the mechanics of what had just happened, and she understood why a man with a family and a warehouse note in 30 days would do exactly what Briggs was doing. But she also understood that this was the first move in a sequence, and that letting it land without response would establish a pattern. How much do we owe you? She said. Briggs looked at her, slightly startled that she'd spoken. $62. We'll pay it in full by end of week, Celeste said. Briggs blinked. You don't have to. We'll pay it, she said again. And then we'd like to continue doing business with you on a cash basis. We understand if that's not possible given your situation, but we wanted to make the offer. Briggs looked at Rowan. Rowan was looking at Celeste with an expression she couldn't interpret in the moment and didn't have time to examine. That'd be... Yes, Briggs said. Yes, cash basis is fine. After he left, Rowan looked at Celeste and said, We don't have $62 liquid. We have 38, she said. I have the rest. That's your money. We're married, she said. Legally, it's both of ours. Also, it doesn't matter whose it is. What matters is that if we let Briggs walk away owing us, he becomes an example. Everyone who has any kind of arrangement with us will hear about it before Sunday. Crowley is trying to isolate us. Every relationship we preserve costs him a piece of the strategy. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, What's the next move? He's going to hit the other suppliers. Possibly the county clerk. There are recording fees Morrison will need covered. Possibly someone on the school board if he decides to make things personal. She had been mapping it in her head since Tuesday morning when Morrison's clerk had sent a note out to the ranch saying the filing had been received. He's going to try to make us expensive to be associated with. He's going to try to starve us out. He's going to try, she said, but he can't call in every note in this county simultaneously. He has to pick and choose, which means the people he doesn't reach first have a window. A window for what? For deciding which way they want to be standing when this is over. Rowan was quiet. He had the look of a man recalculating something he'd thought was one problem and was discovering was 3 connected problems. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since Morrison said Crowley probably knew about the clause deficiency. She sat down at the table. If he knew, he's been running a scheme. Not just against you, against everyone he's done this to. You're probably not the first family he's manipulated into an impossible position using paper he knew was defective. There are others. I'd bet on it. She looked at her hands. Which means we're not just fighting for the ranch. We're fighting for every person in this county who Crowley has a piece of. The fire in the stove popped. Maisie's slate was on the table, her arithmetic from that morning half finished, the chalk still sitting beside it where she'd left it in a hurry. That's a bigger fight than I signed up for, Rowan said quietly. I know. She looked at him directly. You can pull back. You can let Morrison handle it narrowly. Just the one note. Just the one challenge. Maybe it's enough to void the foreclosure, and that's all you wanted. And you? She held his eyes. I'm not pulling back. He sat with that for a moment. Then he made the particular sound of a man who has looked at 2 options and recognized that one of them was only comfortable, not right. What do you need? I need access to the county recorder's office, she said. I need to look at every note Crowley's company has filed in the past 10 years. Every transfer, every foreclosure action, every deed of trust. She paused. And I need Maisie to stay with someone in town for a few days because I don't want her at the ranch if things escalate. Rowan's expression shifted. You think he'd... I think he's a man who has never had his plans seriously threatened, and I don't know what he does when that changes. She kept her voice even. I'd rather Maisie be somewhere safe while we find out. The silence that followed was a different kind from the silences she'd grown accustomed to at Mercer Ranch. This one had weight in it. She watched Rowan work through the specific terror of a parent being told that his child might be a variable in someone else's plan, and she watched him push it somewhere manageable the way people push things they couldn't afford to fall apart over. Doc Fenner and his wife, he said finally. Margaret Fenner was Eleanor's closest friend. She'd take Maisie. Good. He looked at Celeste. Thank you for thinking of her. Celeste stopped. She'd been about to say she's my concern too and checked herself, uncertain whether she had the right to it yet, uncertain what claiming it would mean. She said, she shouldn't be in the middle of this. Rowan nodded slowly. He accepted the half answer without pressing it, which she was grateful for. The recorder's office took 3 days. Celeste went in on a Wednesday morning with a notebook and a request to review public filings, which the county recorder, a young man named Paulson who had been in the job for 8 months and was still at the stage of following procedure because he hadn't yet learned which procedures certain people preferred to see ignored, permitted without any difficulty. What she found in those 3 days was worse than she had expected and better than she had feared, which was its own specific category of discovery. Crowley's holding company had filed 47 foreclosure actions in the county over the past 9 years. Of those, 31 had been completed. The properties transferred, the families dispersed. 16 were in various stages of process. And of the 47, Celeste found note transfer documentation for 32 of them in the recorded files, which meant 32 sets of paperwork she could examine for the same kind of deficiency she'd found in Rowan's documents. She didn't find it in all of them. Crowley wasn't sloppy across the board. He had a sharp enough legal team that most of the documents were sound. But in 9 cases, she found variants of the same problem. The transfer clause modified, or the principal figures inconsistent, or the confirmation documents defective in specific ways that were legal language buried under legal language, invisible to someone who wasn't looking for them, and nearly invisible to someone who was. 9 families. 9 properties. Some already lost. She sat in the recorder's office on the 3rd afternoon with her notebook full and her hand aching from writing, and a feeling in her chest that was not quite rage. Rage was too hot and too fast for what this was, but something colder and more deliberate, like a door closing on a specific decision. Rowan came to collect her at 4 o'clock. He came inside, which surprised her, and came to the table where she was working and looked at her notebook. How many? He said. She told him. He sat down in the chair across from her and looked at the table for a long moment without speaking. She let him. I know some of those families, he said. The Hargrove place, that was 3 years ago. Tom Hargrove took his family to Kansas, sold everything they had first so they wouldn't leave with nothing. He stopped. His wife had a baby that winter. First winter in Kansas. Celeste looked at the notebook. I need to talk to Morrison tonight. I'll write ahead and tell him you're coming. Rowan. She waited until he looked at her. This is going to get bad before it gets better. Morrison said it, and I've been thinking about how bad, specifically. And Crowley is going to do more than cut off suppliers. When he realizes what we have, he's going to try to discredit me. He has enough people in this town that he can shape the story. He's been shaping it since before we married, Rowan said. Yes, but now he has reason to work harder at it. She closed her notebook. He'll say I'm fabricating things. He'll say I'm manipulating you. He'll say whatever he can think of that makes what we found look like a scorned woman's scheme rather than what it is. What it is, Rowan said, is the truth. I know that. You know that. Morrison knows that. She looked at him. The people in this town don't know us well enough to choose the truth over Crowley's version without something more than our word. He was quiet for a moment. What do we need? Witnesses, she said. People Crowley did this to who are willing to come forward. People who can show the pattern is real. She paused. That's the hard part. Because the people he hurt are also the people he frightened, and frightened people don't walk into courtrooms willingly. Rowan picked up her notebook from the table and looked at the cover without opening it. His hand was large, she noticed, with the specific kind of scarring that came from rope work and cold metal and years of doing things that required hands to be useful rather than careful. He set it back down. Tom Hargrove has a brother, he said. Pete lives out on the Willow Creek Road. Tom wrote him letters. He paused. Pete showed me one once, about the foreclosure, what Crowley's men did when they came to take the property. Would Pete talk to Morrison? I don't know. I can ask. I need you to ask, Celeste said. Not for Morrison, for us, for everyone in those files. He looked at her across the recorder's table with the afternoon light coming through the western window and falling across the notebook and the 9 names she had written in careful columns. He had a face that was not easy to read, but that she had been studying for 3 weeks now, and she was beginning to understand the architecture of it. The places where things showed through that he hadn't meant to show, the places where he held things back deliberately, and the difference between those two states. Right now there was something showing through that he hadn't meant to. She couldn't name it precisely, but it looked, she thought, like the specific expression of a man who has spent 2 years being alone in a grief that nobody helped him carry, and who is suddenly and unexpectedly not alone in something, and doesn't quite know what to do with that yet. All right, he said, up. Let's go see Morrison. Morrison's reaction to Celeste's notebook was the controlled alarm of a man who has practiced keeping his face from showing things, but whose eyebrows retain their autonomy. He read through her findings twice, made his own notes, asked 7 specific questions, and then sat back in his chair with the expression of a man doing large arithmetic in his head. 9 cases, he said. 9 I could find documented deficiencies in, Celeste said. There may be others I missed. The records are inconsistent. Some filings are missing entirely, which itself is worth noting. Missing records in the county recorder's office, Morrison said. He took off his spectacles and set them on his desk. That implies someone with access was removing or hiding documents. I noted the gaps, Celeste said. She opened the notebook to the back pages where she'd listed the filing numbers with blank dates beside them. I can't prove what's missing since what's missing isn't there, but the sequence numbers jump. Someone who knows the filing system would recognize what that means. Morrison looked at Paulson's name on her notes. She'd noted who was working when she accessed the files. Paulson is new, Morrison said. He doesn't know what the older files are supposed to look like. Which is probably why certain things are still there that someone more experienced would have removed, Celeste said. Morrison looked at her with an expression that was, for a careful man, something close to admiration. You think systematically, he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. More like an observation that had implications he was still working through. I was a teacher, she said. I spent 4 years explaining to children how to find the thing that doesn't fit in the pattern. It turns out it's the same skill. Rowan was sitting beside her, not contributing much to the legal analysis, but present in a way that mattered. She had noticed that his presence in these conversations changed something about how she was received. Not because she needed his endorsement, but because they were, visibly and plainly, operating together. And that visibly together quality had its own weight. We need to consolidate the cases, Morrison said. He was already moving forward in his head, she could tell. We can't file 9 separate challenges. We need to build one argument that addresses the systematic nature of what Crowley did, pattern of fraud. That's a different legal weight than a single disputed note. That's the kind of case that doesn't get quietly settled. He'll try to settle, Rowan said. He'll try to do a great many things, Morrison said. The question is how much of what he tries to do we can get in front of a judge before he succeeds at any of it. He looked at Celeste. Witnesses? Rowan is speaking to someone this week, she said. I need more than one. Ideally, 3 or 4. People who can testify that the foreclosure process was conducted under false premises, that they were told the debt was legally callable when it may not have been. He paused. And I need them to understand what they're agreeing to. Testifying against Crowley in his own county is not a small thing. I know, Rowan said. I'll be honest with them. The meeting lasted 2 hours. On the way home, in the dark this time, the wagon moving through cold air that had the first real bite of coming winter in it, Celeste looked up at the sky. Clear tonight, the stars dense and indifferent above the mountains, and thought about the 9 families in her notebook. Can I ask you something? She said. Rowan glanced at her. Go ahead. When you came to meet me at the hardware store, the day Crowley arranged it, you could have said no. You could have accepted the foreclosure, started over somewhere else. He thought about it. No, he said. I couldn't. Because of the ranch. Because of Maisie. He was quiet for a moment. The ranch is land. Land is... It matters, but it's land. Maisie has her mother in that ground. Eleanor is buried in the east pasture by the big cottonwood. If I lose that land, Maisie loses the place where her mother is. His voice was level, but it was the specific levelness of someone maintaining a tone rather than feeling one. I couldn't take that from her. Celeste said nothing. I know that might sound... It doesn't sound like anything except what it is, she said quietly. He let the silence sit for a moment. Then, why did you say yes? She thought about how she'd answer this, in the abstract way she thought about questions she knew would eventually be asked. She had several true answers. She chose the most honest one. Because I was tired of being managed, she said. Crowley thought he was putting me somewhere safe and small. He thought a ranch 7 miles from town, a widower who keeps to himself, a ready-made domestic situation. He thought that was a cage I couldn't see the bars of. She looked at her hands in her lap. I'd been fighting him for 4 years from the outside. From the inside, with access to documents and time, and a husband who isn't trying to shrink me. She stopped. Who isn't trying to shrink you? Rowan repeated. Not a question. Most men try to, she said. Not bitterly. As a fact, the way she said most facts, directly, without apology for them. They don't all mean to. Some of them think they're helping, but there's a particular kind of intelligence that men find inconvenient in women, and so they redirect it, diminish it, put it somewhere it can't do much. Rowan was quiet for a while. I don't find it inconvenient. I know, she said. That's why I'm still looking. The wagon went on through the dark. Somewhere to the north, a coyote started, and another answered, and then they were silent again. Maisie asked about you today, Rowan said. It came out carefully, like he was trying the weight of it before putting it down. From Margaret Fenner's, she sent a note with the Fenner boy. What did she ask? She asked if you were coming to visit her before we brought her home. A pause. I told her probably yes. Celeste looked at the dark road ahead of them. Then probably yes, she said. She heard something in his breathing change, not dramatically, just a small release, an exhale that was slightly longer than the last one, like something that had been held tight for a moment and wasn't anymore. She didn't comment on it. Some things didn't need commentary. They just needed to be allowed to be what they were. The trouble came on a Friday, 9 days after Morrison filed the consolidated challenge. It came in the form of 2 men who arrived at the ranch in the late morning when Rowan was out in the north pasture checking fence, and Celeste was alone in the house. She heard the horses before she saw them. 2 sets of hooves, steady, not rushing, the kind of pace that meant they weren't in a hurry because they didn't think they needed to be. She was at the kitchen table with documents. She stayed where she was and waited. They knocked. She stood, took a moment to decide, then went to the door and opened it. 2 men. Not Crowley. He wouldn't come himself for something like this. She'd known that already. These were men in the middle range of his organization, the kind of men who did the work that maintained plausible deniability. The one on the left was broad, unremarkable, wearing a coat with a deputy's star pinned to it that looked new enough that the pin hadn't worn through the fabric yet. The one on the right was thinner, better dressed, carrying a leather document case. Mrs. Mercer, the thinner one said. He didn't offer his name, which told her something. I'm here on behalf of a client who has an interest in some documents you've been reviewing at the county recorder's office. She looked at him. What client? That's not relevant to this visit. It is to me. She kept her hand on the doorframe. I have nothing to discuss with unnamed parties. Mrs. Mercer. The thinner man's voice shifted into something that was almost apologetic and was actually the shape of a threat. There are questions about whether the access you were granted to certain records was properly authorized. My client is concerned that sensitive financial documents may have been copied or retained. Every record I reviewed is a public filing, she said. Access to public filings is a matter of law, not authorization. The concern is about what was done with the information. The information is being used in a legal proceeding, she said, which is also a matter of public record. If your client has a concern about the legal proceeding, he can address it in court. She began to close the door. Good morning. The man with the deputy's star put his hand against the door. Not hard, just There. Celeste looked at his hand, then she looked at his face. "Remove your hand from my door," she said. Her voice was completely steady. Steadier, she thought, than she actually felt, which was a skill she had learned in 4 years of standing in rooms where people expected her to back down. A beat. Then another. He removed his hand. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it and listened to them stand on the porch for 15 seconds, then walk to their horses, then ride away. Then she went to the table and sat down, and her hands were not, she noted, entirely steady. She put them flat on the table and pressed until they were. She was writing in her notebook when Rowan came in at midday. He looked at her face and put down his gloves without saying anything for a moment. "What happened?" he said. She told him. She kept it factual and direct, which was how she told things, but she saw his expression do the thing where it went very still, and then resolved into something that was not at all still underneath. "The one with the star," he said. "New pin on the coat?" "Yes." "That's Doyle. He works for Crowley's brother-in-law who's on the county sheriff's board." He sat down. He was looking at the wall. "They're not going to stop." "I know. They'll escalate. If the visit didn't scare you, it didn't." "I know it didn't," he said. He looked at her then, directly. "That's what I mean. They're going to escalate because you're not scared." She looked back at him. "Are you telling me I should be scared?" "I'm telling you they're going to try harder," he said. "There's a difference." A pause. "I'm not telling you to stop. I'm not asking you to be smaller or quieter or more careful in the way that means less. I'm just—" He stopped. Started again. "I'm asking you to tell me. Everything. Whatever they do next. Don't handle it alone." She heard what was underneath the request. Not let me protect you, which would have been the wrong offer from the wrong direction. Something more like, we are in this together and I need to know what's happening to us. "All right," she said. "All right," he said back. He poured himself coffee and sat at the table and looked at her notebook and said, "Morrison needs to know about this visit." "I know. I was already writing it up." He picked up his coffee cup and drank from it and didn't say anything else. And neither did she. And the silence between them was different now from the silences of those first weeks. Not comfortable exactly. There was nothing comfortable about any of this, but inhabited, shared. The silence of people who had stopped being strangers and had started being something that didn't have a clean name yet. Outside, the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall. Not the dry dusting they'd had in October, but the thick, steady kind that meant business, that would cover the north fence and the east pasture and the cottonwood where Eleanor Mercer was buried, and everything else, under the same even white, indifferent to all distinctions. Celeste looked at it through the window. Then she looked at her notebook and went back to work. The snow stayed. It settled over Mercer Ranch the way trouble settles over a life, quietly at first, then permanently, reshaping everything underneath it until you couldn't quite remember what the ground had looked like before. By the third week of November, the north pasture was buried past the lower fence rails, and Rowan was spending 2 hours each morning just getting feed to the cattle, breaking ice on the water troughs with a hand axe, doing the 1,000 small physical negotiations that winter on a Colorado ranch demanded from a man, whether or not he had a fraud case building in a lawyer's office in town. Celeste helped where she could and stayed out of the way where she couldn't. She had no illusions about her usefulness with livestock. She could do the basic work, the carrying and breaking ice and distributing hay, but Rowan moved through those tasks with the efficiency of someone who had done them so long the actions were stored in his muscles rather than his mind. And a second person without that same fluency often created more friction than help. So she split her time. Mornings outdoors doing whatever was needed, afternoons at the kitchen table with the documents. The documents had grown. Morrison had gathered the paperwork from 3 other families who had agreed to speak with him. Pete Hargrove, whose brother Tom had lost the homestead 3 years ago. A widow named Agnes Pratt, whose 20-acre property on the South Road had been foreclosed the previous spring. And a cattle farmer named Del Wickies, who had managed to delay his own foreclosure through the accident of having a cousin in the county assessor's office who had quietly flagged an irregularity that nobody had followed up on until now. Each set of documents landed on Celeste's table, and she went through them with the same systematic attention she had given the first, cross-referencing with the county filing she'd copied in her notebook, building what Morrison was calling the evidentiary architecture of the case, which was a formal phrase for something that felt, from the inside, more like assembling a picture from fragments, knowing the picture was there but not yet certain how many pieces you were missing. She was doing exactly this on a Tuesday afternoon when she found it. She had been through the Pratt documents twice already and thought she'd extracted everything useful. Agnes Pratt's note had the same transfer clause deficiencies she'd found in the Mercer documents. Different numbers, same structural problem, and she'd noted it and moved on. But on the second pass, she'd found a letter tucked inside the back fold of the document case that Morrison had either not noticed or not recognized as significant. A letter from Crowley's holding company to Agnes Pratt, dated 4 months before the foreclosure action was filed. The letter informed Agnes Pratt that her account had been reviewed and her outstanding balance adjusted to reflect a penalty assessment under Section 7 of the original note. Section 7. Celeste pulled Agnes Pratt's original note from the stack and turned to Section 7. She read it. She read it again. Section 7 outlined penalty assessment conditions, specifically the conditions under which additional fees could be added to the principal. The language was standard and dense. She had read it before and moved past it, but now she read it alongside the letter and she saw what she had missed. The penalty assessment Crowley's company had applied to Agnes Pratt's account was not authorized under Section 7. The conditions required to trigger the penalty hadn't been met. The adjustment had been made without legal basis. It had inflated Agnes Pratt's outstanding balance by $400, which had pushed her account past the default threshold, which had made the foreclosure action possible. They hadn't just used a defective transfer clause. They had manufactured the default. Celeste sat very still and looked at the letter and the note side by side on the table and understood, with the particular cold clarity that came from seeing the full shape of something, that she was looking at deliberate systematic fraud, not a technicality, not a gray area. Crowley's company had been artificially inflating balances to trigger defaults on accounts that would not otherwise have defaulted. They had been creating the conditions for foreclosure and then executing the foreclosure and then selling the properties, and they had been doing it to people who didn't have the legal knowledge to see what was happening to them. She thought about Tom Hargrove selling everything he owned and taking his family to Kansas. She thought about the baby born in the first Kansas winter. She thought about 9 families in her notebook and 31 completed foreclosures in the county records. She thought about Victor Crowley in his good suit with his oiled hair and his reasonable face, arranging her marriage and calling it a favor. She got up and put on her coat and went to find Rowan. He was in the barn. She stood in the doorway and said, "I need to go to Morrison's tonight." He looked at her face. He had gotten better at reading it, or she had gotten less careful about what she let show. She wasn't sure which. He said, "What did you find?" She told him, standing in the barn doorway with the cold coming in behind her, and the horses watching with the mild incuriosity of animals who had decided humans were not worth tracking. She laid it out in order, factually, the way she laid everything out, but she heard her own voice and knew it wasn't entirely level. Something in it had an edge she hadn't fully controlled. When she finished, Rowan was quiet for a moment. He had been brushing Jasper when she came in, and he was still holding the brush, but he had stopped moving. "He manufactured the defaults," Rowan said. "Yes. On multiple properties. Agnes Pratt's for certain. I need to go back through the others with this in mind. I may have missed it in the other files because I wasn't looking for penalty assessments specifically." She paused. If the pattern holds, it's not 9 questionable cases. It's a systematic operation. Rowan set the brush down on the stall rail. He turned and looked at her fully, and his face had that quality again. The controlled underneath quality. The door that looks closed thing. But there was something else now, too. Something that wasn't controlled at all and wasn't trying to be. "This is enough," he said. Not a question. "This is more than enough," she said. "This is the case Morrison needs. This isn't just a contested note. This is evidence of a deliberate scheme to defraud property owners across the county. This is criminal territory." The word criminal sat between them in the cold barn air. "He's not going to let it get to a courtroom without a fight," Rowan said. "No. He's going to come after us." "He already is," she said. The men at the door were the beginning. He's had 4 weeks since Morrison filed, and he's had time to figure out that this is bigger than one disputed note. He knows what we're building. She looked at Rowan steadily. which means we have to move faster than he does. Rowan picked up his coat from the stall gate. I'll saddle Jasper. It's past dark. Morrison said come when you have something significant. He was already reaching for the saddle. You have something significant. The ride into town was the coldest Celeste had made since arriving in Colorado, the temperature having dropped the way it did on clear winter nights. Fast and indifferent, the sky brilliant and freezing above them, the road a pale strip between walls of dark pines. She rode the mare Rowan had given her use of, a sorrel named Ruth, who was sensible and sturdy and had the good quality of not requiring much conversation. Rowan rode Jasper beside her, close enough that she could hear his breathing in the cold air. They didn't talk much on the road. There wasn't much to say that the documents hadn't already said. Morrison opened his door in his dressing gown, looked at them both for a moment, and stepped back to let them in without comment. He was that kind of man, Celeste had decided. The kind whose response to being woken at 9 in the evening by a rancher and his wife with new evidence was to put the kettle on and sit down. She laid the letter in the relevant section of Agnes Pratt's note on his desk and explained what she'd found in the same precise way she'd explained it to Rowan. Morrison listened without interrupting, which was his habit. He absorbed information in full before responding, which she appreciated because it meant his responses were actually responsive rather than just reactive. When she finished, he was quiet for 30 seconds. Then he said, "The penalty assessment. Unauthorized under the terms of the note." And it was the assessment that pushed her over the default threshold. By exactly enough, not by more. She met his eyes. That's not a coincidence. If it were careless, the number would be approximate. It's precise because it was calculated. Morrison stood up and went to his cabinet where he kept his own case files and pulled out the Mercer documents. He opened to a page, found a section, read it. His jaw shifted. "The Mercer note," he said slowly. "There's a penalty assessment here as well. I noted it but characterized it as a processing fee. It's described differently." He set the page down and looked at Celeste. "I may have been wrong about that." "I thought it was a processing fee too," she said, "the first time through." If the Mercer account also had an artificially inflated balance, then the debt threshold was manufactured there too, Celeste said, which means the entire basis for the foreclosure threat was created deliberately. She paused. Which means the marriage arrangement was coerced using a fraudulent legal premise. He didn't just use a defective note. He built the crisis. The room was very quiet. Morrison looked at the documents on his desk. Rowan looked at the floor, which was his way of processing things that were bigger than expected. Celeste looked at Morrison and waited. "We need to go to the district court," Morrison said. "Not the county court. District. This is above the county level, and frankly, I don't trust the county bench on anything Crowley adjacent anymore. I should have felt that way sooner." He looked up. "I can file a fraud complaint with the district by end of week. But I need your depositions, both of you, this week. And I need Agnes Pratt and Pete Hargrove and Del Wickies to come in and give theirs." He paused. "And I need you to understand that when we file at the district level, it becomes public record immediately. Every newspaper in the county will have it within days." "Good," Celeste said. Morrison looked at her. "That's what you want." "Crowley's power in this county is based on controlling the story," she said. "He controls it because people only hear his version. The moment this is public record, his version competes with documents." She held his gaze. "Documents don't care who he knows." Morrison looked at Rowan. "File it," Rowan said. The next morning, Celeste went back through every document in every case file with the penalty assessment question in the front of her mind, and she found variants of the same structure in 6 of the 9 files she had flagged. 6 cases where the outstanding balance had been adjusted upward by a calculated amount, enough to trigger default, presented in language designed to look like routine accounting rather than what it was. She also found in the Wikis file something she hadn't expected, a copy of an internal memorandum. She had no idea how it had ended up in Del Wickies' documents. Possibly Wickies' cousin in the assessor's office had slipped it in. Possibly it had been misfiled. Possibly whoever was supposed to remove these things had made an error in the Wikis case. A memorandum from Crowley's company to Belford, the attorney, dated 3 years prior, discussing what it called threshold management on a list of accounts. Threshold management. She read the memorandum 3 times. It was written in the careful language of people who know what they're doing is wrong and have decided that the trick is to never say it plainly. But the meaning was not obscure once you knew what to look for. The memorandum described a systematic process for reviewing accounts, identifying which ones were close to the default threshold, calculating adjustments that would push them over, and timing the filing of foreclosure actions to minimize the window for legal response. It was, she thought, the most damning document she had ever held in her hands. She sat with it for a long time before she moved. Then she made 3 copies of it by hand, careful, exact, letter by letter, and put the original in the locked tin with her own documents, and put 1 copy in a separate envelope addressed to Morrison, and kept 1 copy in her notebook. She did not put all 3 copies in the same place. She had started to think about redundancy, about what happened to evidence that existed in only one place. She told Rowan about the memorandum that evening. She set it in front of him at the kitchen table and watched him read it, or try to read it. He tracked through it slowly, parsing the legal language with visible effort, but he got there. She watched the moment he understood what threshold management meant, applied to his own account, and Eleanor's careful paperwork, and 3 years of building toward a crisis that Victor Crowley had engineered from a desk in a stone building with peeling green paint. His face went through several things and settled on something that was not any of the clean emotions, not pure anger or pure grief, but the specific compound of a person who has just understood the full dimensions of how they were wronged and is deciding what to do with that understanding. He built it, Rowan said. His voice was quiet, too quiet. From the beginning, he bought the note specifically to do this. That's what the memorandum indicates. He planned to take my ranch before he ever sent me that demand letter. Yes. Eleanor was already sick, he said, and then he stopped. He looked at the table. She was already sick when the note transferred. She was managing the paperwork from bed the last 6 months. She caught it. She caught something was wrong. She told me the numbers didn't feel right, and I told her. He stopped again. His hands were flat on the table, pressing down the way he did when he needed his body to hold something his face couldn't. I told her not to worry about it. Celeste didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that kind of regret that wouldn't sound hollow. She just sat with it and let it be what it was. After a minute, he said, "She would have figured it out if she'd had time." "She did figure it out," Celeste said quietly. "She kept every document. She kept the original application. She kept the fee schedule. She put everything in a box and she latched it and she put it under the bed." She paused. "She gave you everything you needed. She just couldn't tell you what to do with it." Rowan looked at the table. "She expected you to find it eventually," Celeste said. "That's why she kept it." He was quiet for a long time. The fire in the stove burned steadily. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in that ocean sound way that Celeste had grown to know as the particular voice of this place. The sound of Mercer Ranch at night, in winter, which she had heard every night for 6 weeks now, and which she had stopped noticing as foreign. "I want to bring Maisie home," Rowan said finally. Morrison said to wait until after the district filing. "I know what Morrison said." He looked up. "She's been at the Fenners for 2 weeks. She sent another note yesterday asking when she can come back." He paused. "She asked if you were still here." Celeste looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were still here and you were busy and we'd bring her home as soon as it was safe." He held her eyes. "She said to tell you she's been doing her arithmetic." Something moved through Celeste's chest, quiet and unasked for. She pressed it somewhere manageable. "She can come home after the filing," she said. "That's 3 days. Morrison said once it's public record, there's less reason for Crowley to do anything to us directly. Anything that happens to us after a public filing points straight back at him." 3 days, Rowan said. 3 days. He nodded. He picked up the memorandum, looked at it once more, and set it back down. "I want to be in the courtroom," he said. "When this goes to hearing, I want to be in that room." "We'll both be there," she said. "I know." He looked at her and his expression was not the complicated closed thing she had spent 6 weeks learning to read. It was simpler than that, plainer. The expression of a man who has not had a person beside him for 2 years and has noticed, with the specific surprise of someone who had stopped expecting it, that there is someone there now. I mean, I want us to be there together, both of us. He paused. You've done most of this. The finding, the reading, the thinking. You did this. Morrison did the legal work. You handed Morrison the ammunition, Rowan said. You found what Eleanor started. He stopped, recalibrated, tried again. I'm trying to say something and not managing it very well. You're managing it fine, she said. I'm trying to say thank you. I know, she said. A pause, then, is that all you're going to say back? She almost smiled. I'm still deciding. He looked at her for a moment with something in his eyes that was not quite humor and not quite something else, and was probably both. Then he looked at the memorandum again, then at the stove, then at his coffee cup. 3 more days, he said. 3 more days, she confirmed. The district filing went in on a Friday. By Saturday morning, the Coldwater Bluff Courier had a partial account of it on the front page, not because anyone had told the editor directly, but because public filings were public, and at least 2 people in the county recorder's office had read the filing and told their wives, who had told their neighbors. By Saturday afternoon, the account was reasonably complete in its broad facts. The Mercer Ranch fraud case, the systematic nature of the allegations, the number of families named, the word that there was documentary evidence. Morrison had warned them it would move fast. It moved faster than fast. By Sunday morning, there was a letter from Belford, the attorney at their door. Celeste read it at the kitchen table. It was addressed to both of them, which she noted as an acknowledgement that could not have been comfortable for Crowley to authorize. The letter proposed a private resolution, a settlement discussion, terms to be negotiated. It used the phrase mutual benefit twice, which was the legal language for, we'd like you to stop before you do more damage. She set it on the table in front of Rowan, who read it with the same slow care he'd used on the memorandum. He wants to settle, Rowan said. He wants us to go away quietly, Celeste said. That's not the same thing. You want to refuse. I want to take it to Morrison and let him advise us properly, she said. But yes, fundamentally, yes. A private settlement means confidentiality. It means nobody knows the full shape of what he did. It means the families who already lost their properties get nothing and Crowley walks away. She looked at Rowan. This isn't about us anymore. It's about the memorandum. It's about 31 foreclosed properties. And every family that lost something because he manufactured a crisis they didn't know was manufactured. Rowan read the letter a second time. He set it down. Morrison, he said. Today, if possible. He stood up. He was already dressed. He was always dressed before she came to the kitchen, one of the reliable rhythms of his days that she had absorbed without meaning to. He picked up his coat. I'll get the horses, he said. Morrison read the settlement letter with no expression whatsoever, which was, Celeste had learned, a different thing from having no reaction. When he set it down, he said, He's scared. He should be, Rowan said. He should be, Morrison agreed. But scared men are unpredictable. This letter is the polite version of what he might do. He looked at them both. You need to understand that if you refuse this, and I believe you should refuse it to be clear, he is going to escalate. The men at your door were a warning. Actual escalation is different. What does actual escalation look like? Celeste said. Morrison looked at her. Interference with witnesses, tampering with filings, pressure on the district clerk. Possibly something more direct. He paused. He has enough influence with the county sheriff's board that he could create legal problems for you that would need to be defended. Nuisance actions, false complaints, things that would cost time and money, even if they came to nothing. He can't do all of those things simultaneously, Celeste said. Not without each one being visible. And visible right now with a public fraud filing and a Courier article and a district hearing scheduled means that every move he makes points back at him. That's correct, Morrison said, which is why we move quickly. The hearing is in 3 weeks. Between now and then, we need all 4 witness depositions complete, your complete documentary evidence compiled in admissible form, and a brief that makes the systematic nature of the fraud impossible to dispute. He looked at Celeste specifically. I need you to write up a full account of how you found the penalty assessment pattern, narrative form, step by step, because you are going to be asked to explain it in that courtroom, and it needs to be clear enough that a judge who doesn't know property law can follow it. I can do that, she said. I know you can. He almost said something else, then stopped. then said it anyway. Mrs. Mercer, what you found in those documents, the memorandum specifically, is the kind of evidence that changes careers. Crowley's attorneys are going to attempt to challenge how it was obtained, argue it's inadmissible, argue it was misfiled and therefore improperly accessed. I want you to be prepared for that. They're going to try to make the finding about you rather than about the fraud. They're going to try to make me the problem, she said. Yes. That's not new, she said flatly. That's what people do when they can't argue the substance. Morrison held her gaze for a moment. No, he said. It's not new. And something in his voice acknowledged, in the understated way of cautious men, that he knew something about what it had cost her to be in this room with this evidence having come from where she'd come from. She didn't need the acknowledgement, but she didn't refuse it either. On the wagon ride home, the snow had gone hard and the road was slick in places, requiring attention. They rode mostly in silence, which was fine. There was enough happening inside the silence to fill it. It was Rowan who spoke first, about a mile from the ranch turnoff. I'm going to get Maisie tomorrow, he said. Celeste looked at him. The filing is public. Morrison said that reduces the direct risk, and she's been gone 2 weeks, and He stopped. I'm done waiting. All right, she said. Will you come? She looked at the road. The pines on both sides were thick with snow. The branches bowed under the weight of it, and in the last light of the afternoon they were that particular shade of blue-white that Celeste had come to understand was specific to this place, this elevation, this quality of cold that was different from any other cold she'd known. Yes, she said. I'll come. He nodded once, and they went on down the road toward the smoke coming from the chimney, toward the light in the window that they had started leaving on for each other without deciding to, without discussing it, without either of them naming it as the particular kind of small and ordinary thing that means more than it looks like from the outside. The lamp was burning in the window. The snow was falling again. And 3 weeks stood between them and a courtroom where Victor Crowley was going to discover, in front of a district judge and everyone who had spent years being afraid of him, that he had miscalculated the one time it would cost him everything. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the longest of Celeste's life, and she had lived through some long stretches. Crowley did what Morrison had predicted. Not all at once. He was too careful for that. But in sequence, each move calibrated to cost them something without being traceable directly back to him. The county tax assessor's office sent a notice questioning the valuation on the Mercer South pasture, a challenge that would require a formal response and filing fees. A rumor circulated in town that Celeste had fabricated the internal memorandum, that she had forged Crowley's company letterhead, that the whole case was a desperate invention by a disgraced woman trying to rehabilitate herself through her husband's trouble. 2 of Morrison's other clients quietly withdrew their business, which Morrison reported without complaint, but which Celeste understood as a message about the cost of being associated with them. And then, 11 days before the hearing, Doyle came back. He came alone this time, no thin attorney beside him, and he came in the evening when the light was already gone and the ranch was the kind of dark that was specific to places far from towns. Full dark, the mountains invisible, the only light the lamp in the window and the stars overhead. Rowan was in the barn finishing the last feeding. Maisie was at the kitchen table working through a reading lesson with Celeste, sitting close enough that their shoulders almost touched, which had become her habit over the 2 weeks since she'd come home. She had attached herself to Celeste's physical proximity with the matter-of-fact practicality of a child who had decided something and wasn't interested in discussing it. Celeste heard the horse before Maisie did. She looked up and looked at the window. "Go to your room," she said to Maisie. Maisie looked at her face and went without arguing, which told Celeste that the child understood more about what was happening on this ranch than either adult had explicitly told her. The knock on the door was not a polite knock. It was the knock of a man who doesn't need to pretend. Celeste picked up the lamp and went to the door and opened it, and Doyle was standing on the porch in the cold with his coat open and his hands visible, which was interesting, either a signal that he wasn't there for physical intimidation or a performance of the same thing. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Doyle." She held the lamp up enough to see his face. "Mr. Mercer is in the barn. If your business is with him, my business is with you," Doyle said. "Mr. Crowley would like to extend a revised offer, more generous than the letter. He asked me to convey the terms personally." Mr. Crowley can convey his terms through his attorney to mine, she said. That's how legal proceedings work. He thought a more personal conversation might be productive. Doyle looked past her into the house. He also asked me to mention that your husband's daughter spends time at the Fenner household, that the roads between here and town can be unpredictable in winter. The sentence sat there. Celeste looked at Doyle for a long moment. She felt something in her chest that was not fear, or not only fear, but something sharper and more useful than fear. The kind of clarity that came from a threat being made so explicitly that there was no longer any ambiguity about what kind of man you were dealing with. Write down exactly what you just said to me, she said. Her voice was completely even. Doyle blinked. What? What you just said. Write it down. Word for word, date it. She held his eyes. Because you just threatened a child in front of a witness, and I intend to include it in our evidentiary filing with the district court on Monday morning. She paused. Or you can leave, and I won't mention your name at all. I'll simply note that an agent of Crowley's made a threatening reference to my husband's daughter, identity uncertain. Doyle stared at her. Those are your options, she said. Take the one that's better for you. He left. He didn't say anything else. He turned and walked to his horse and rode away into the dark, and Celeste stood in the doorway and watched until she couldn't hear the hooves anymore. And then she closed the door and stood with her back against it. Rowan was coming across the yard from the barn. He must have seen the horse from inside. He came in through the door and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" She told him. She told him the specific words Doyle had used about Maisie and the roads, and she watched the door that looks closed thing happen on his face, except this time the door did not hold. Something came through it that she had not seen on him before. Not the controlled deep anger she'd seen when she'd told him about manufactured defaults, not the compressed grief she'd seen when he understood what had been done to Eleanor's careful paperwork. Something colder and more direct. The face of a man who has just been shown the exact boundary of what he will tolerate. He threatened Maisie, Rowan said. He implied it, Celeste said, carefully enough to be deniable. She looked at him. But we're going to include it in the filing anyway, because if Crowley is willing to imply threats against a child 11 days before a district hearing, then he is more desperate than we thought. And desperate men make errors. She paused. He made one tonight. Rowan looked at her for a long moment. Then he went down the hall to Maisie's room. She heard the door open, heard the low murmur of his voice, heard Maisie say something she couldn't make out. She stayed in the kitchen and added wood to the stove and put the kettle on. And when Rowan came back, his face had settled back into the thing it did, that controlled quality, but underneath it, something had shifted. She's fine, he said. I know. He sat down at the table. He put his hands flat on the wood in the way she recognized as the gesture he used when he needed to hold on to something solid. How close are we, he said, to the hearing, to having enough? We have enough, she said. We've had enough since the memorandum. What we have now is more than enough. She sat across from him. Morrison sent word yesterday that Del Wicks has agreed to testify in person. That's 4 witnesses. That's 4 accounts of the same pattern from 4 different people. Combined with the documentary evidence and the memorandum, a district judge would have to work very hard to find for Crowley. Can a district judge be bought? It was the question she had been not quite asking herself for 3 weeks. She answered it honestly. Possibly. But a district ruling can be appealed to the state level, and a state appeal becomes a state story. Crowley is powerful in this county. He is not powerful enough to suppress a state-level fraud case. She looked at Rowan. He knows that. That's why he's sending people to our door at night instead of feeling comfortable. He knows if this gets to a real courtroom, he loses. So we just have to get there. We just have to get there, she said. Getting there was not simple. On the Monday before the hearing, Morrison's office window was broken overnight. Nothing taken, nothing destroyed, just broken. The glass inside on the floor, the cold coming in. Morrison reported it to the sheriff's office, who recorded the complaint and did nothing with a speed that suggested instruction. Morrison boarded the window himself and filed an addendum to the fraud complaint noting the incident. On Wednesday, Agnes Pratt sent word that she was reconsidering her testimony. Celeste rode out to Agnes Pratt's rented room on the East Road herself. Rode out in the cold without telling Rowan where she was going until she was already on Ruth's back, because she knew he would want to come, and she needed to do this one alone. Agnes Pratt was a small woman in her 60s, with a face that had the specific geography of someone who had weathered too many things and was tired of being asked to weather more. She opened her door and looked at Celeste with exhausted wariness. "They came to see me," Agnes said. "Two men. They said if I testified, there'd be questions about how I managed my late husband's affairs. They said they could make trouble." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that—" Agnes stopped. She looked at the floor. "My son has a contract with the county for road maintenance. They said the contract might not be renewed." Celeste stood in Agnes Pratt's doorway and looked at this woman and understood the full weight of what Crowley had built. Not just the legal fraud, but the web of dependencies and threats and small leverages that kept people in line, that made doing the right thing an unaffordable luxury for ordinary people with sons who had contracts in road maintenance businesses and things that could be taken away. "Agnes," she said, "I can't promise your son's contract will be safe. I can't promise that testifying won't have costs." She paused. "But I can tell you that if we lose this hearing, the costs are permanent. Crowley stays in power. He keeps doing this to people. Your testimony isn't the only one. There are 3 others. But yours matters because you're the clearest example of the penalty assessment fraud. You're the one where the numbers are most plain." Agnes was quiet. "You already lost your property," Celeste said. Not cruelly, plainly, the way she said plain things. "He already took it. He can't take it again." She held the older woman's eyes. "What he's threatening now is your son's livelihood. I understand why that's frightening, but I want you to consider what it means if a county where Victor Crowley can threaten a grieving widow's son over a road contract is also a county where he keeps all his power." Agnes looked out the window for a long time. Then she said, "My husband worked 40 years for that property." "I know," Celeste said. "He built the fence himself, every post." "I know." Agnes was quiet for another moment. Then, "I'll be there." The morning of the hearing was the coldest morning Celeste could remember in Colorado, which was saying something. The thermometer outside the ranch door read 15 degrees before sunrise. She dressed in the dark, heard Rowan already in the kitchen, came in to find coffee made, and Maisie at the table in her nightgown with her arms wrapped around herself, watching both of them with the alert seriousness of a child who understood that today was different. "Will you win?" Maisie asked. Rowan looked at Celeste. Celeste looked at Maisie. "We have good evidence," Celeste said. "We have honest witnesses. We have a lawyer who knows what he's doing." She paused. "I can't promise you will win. I can tell you we've done everything right." Maisie considered this. "Mama used to say that doing everything right doesn't always fix things." "Your mama was right," Celeste said. "But she also said it was the only thing worth doing." Rowan turned toward the stove. Celeste looked at the table. "She was right about that too," she said. The Coldwater Bluff District Courthouse was a 2-story brick building on the north end of town that smelled of wood polish and old paper and the specific anxiety of people waiting for decisions to be made about their lives. The hearing room held perhaps 40 people, and it was full. Celeste had not expected that. She had thought the threat of Crowley's retribution would keep most of the town away, and she had been wrong. Hector Briggs was there. The hardware store owner was there. Several faces she recognized from her months in town, people who had been cool or cautious or carefully neutral, sitting in the gallery rows with expressions that were hard to read, but whose presence alone was a statement. Pete Hargrove sat in the front row of the gallery with his hands on his knees and the face of a man who had driven a long way to be somewhere important. Agnes Pratt sat beside him, back straight, in the good dress that was clearly her good dress, the kind of garment saved for occasions that mattered. Crowley was there with Belford and 2 other attorneys, which told Celeste everything about how afraid he was. A man with nothing to worry about brings 1 attorney. He had brought 3. He looked across the room at her when she came in. She looked back. His face did the reasonable expression that she had seen in his bank office. The managed pleasantness of a man who had spent decades controlling situations and controlling the stories about situations. But there was something different in it today. A tightness around the eyes, a quality that was not quite certainty. Good, she thought. He should be uncertain. Morrison was already at the counsel table. He looked at Celeste and nodded once, which was his version of "we're ready." The judge was a woman, District Judge Helena Marsh, 60, with steel gray hair and the manner of someone who had been doing this long enough to be interested only in what was true and bored by everything else. She came in without ceremony, sat, looked at both counsel tables, and said, "Let's begin." What followed was not the dramatic courtroom scene that Celeste had sometimes imagined in the nights of lying awake reconstructing documents and calculating risks. It was methodical and slow, and occasionally tedious, and completely, entirely real. Morrison presented the evidence in the sequence they had built it: the original promissory note, the transfer deficiency, the penalty assessment pattern, the memorandum, the 4 witness accounts. He walked through each piece with the precision of a man who had spent 3 weeks organizing his argument to be impossible to misunderstand. Crowley's attorneys challenged everything. They challenged the memorandum's chain of custody, which Morrison had anticipated and countered with Paulson's testimony about the filing records. They challenged the interpretation of the transfer clause, which Morrison rebutted with 2 precedents from the state appellate court. They challenged Celeste's qualifications to analyze financial documents, which Morrison rebutted by having her explain her findings directly to Judge Marsh, while Marsh took notes. That was the moment Celeste would remember. Standing before a district judge and explaining in plain English exactly what she had found and how she had found it. The sticking letter E on the original note, the fee schedule in Eleanor's box, the penalty assessment in Agnes Pratt's file, the memorandum with its careful language about threshold management. She laid it out the way she would have laid out a lesson, clearly, in order, connecting each piece to the next. Judge Marsh listened without expression. She asked 2 questions. Both were precise and showed she understood the documents. Celeste answered them directly. Crowley's lead attorney tried to reframe Celeste's account as the work of a disgruntled woman with a history of making accusations against established institutions. Morrison objected. Judge Marsh sustained the objection with the flat brevity of someone who found that approach tiresome and said so. The witnesses testified. Agnes Pratt testified with the steady voice of a woman who had decided that her husband's 40 years deserved to be said plainly in a room where it would be recorded. Pete Hargrove testified about his brother's foreclosure and the letter Tom had sent from Kansas in the first winter. Del Wickies testified about the assessor's flag and what he'd found when he finally looked at his own documents. Crowley testified. It was the most instructive thing Celeste had watched in a long time. He was smooth for the first 20 minutes, reasonable, measured, the managed pleasantness doing its work. But Morrison had built his cross-examination around the memorandum, and a man who had written threshold management in a company document could not explain it away by being reasonable. Morrison asked him to explain the phrase. He said it referred to routine account review. Morrison asked him to explain why routine account review resulted in balance adjustments that consistently pushed accounts to the exact default threshold. He said accounting errors. Morrison asked why the errors were always upward and never downward. He said he would have to review the records. Judge Marsh looked at him for a moment when he said that. Just looked. It was a look that asked a very specific question without using words. The hearing lasted 6 hours. At the end of it, Judge Marsh said she would deliberate and deliver her finding within 7 days. 7 days was the next long stretch. The finding came in 5. Morrison's clerk rode out to the ranch with the notice. Celeste was in the yard splitting kindling. She had taken to the task in recent weeks, finding the clean mechanical work of it useful for thinking, when the clerk came down the road. She set down the axe and walked to meet him. She read the notice standing in the snow. Judge Marsh found in favor of the plaintiffs. The foreclosure action against Mercer Ranch was voided in full. The promissory note was declared unenforceable based on the documented deficiencies in the transfer and the fraudulent manipulation of the account balance. The district court was referring the matter to the state attorney general for criminal investigation of systematic fraud across all 9 documented cases. Crowley's company was ordered to cease all collection actions on the flagged accounts pending the criminal investigation. A lien had been placed on Crowley's assets. She read it again. Then she walked to the barn where Rowan was working because he should read it himself. He read it standing in the barn doorway, the paper in his hands. She watched him. He read slowly, the way he read everything, giving the words the attention they deserved. When he got to the bottom, he was still for a moment, looking at the last line. Then he looked at her. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He could see her face, and her face was not the face of someone who had won something. It was the face of someone who had gotten to the other side of something long and difficult and was still processing what the other side looked like. He held out the paper to her, and she took it back, and they stood in the barn doorway in the winter light and let it be real. The collapse of Crowley's local empire was not elegant. These things never are. It took months, not days. The state attorney general's investigation moved at its own pace, which was deliberate and thorough. Crowley's network of leveraged relationships fell apart gradually, not because people suddenly had courage they hadn't had before, but because his ability to threaten consequences had depended on his ability to deliver them. And a man with a criminal investigation and a lien on his assets and his company's operations frozen could not deliver the same consequences he once had. The fear, without the machinery behind it, turned out to be just fear. Freestanding, unsupported, lighter than it had looked. Doyle disappeared, not dramatically. He just stopped being in Coldwater Bluff, which the town noted and did not mourn. Belford, the attorney, filed for reassignment to Crowley's Denver office and was declined, the Denver office having its own problems by then. By spring, Crowley himself had been formally charged with fraud, and by summer he had been tried and convicted on 7 counts, and he was led out of a Denver courtroom in August with the same careful posture he'd always had, the reasonableness still on his face, but alone for the first time. His attorneys on one side of the bar, not the other. The town remembered. Towns always do, though not always the right things. What Coldwater Bluff remembered, in the months after the hearing, was not its own fear. Memory had a way of softening that. What it remembered was the woman who had come to town in disgrace and gone through a strange marriage and spent winter nights with a lamp burning past midnight and found the piece of paper that undid a decade of systematic theft. The story simplified itself, as stories do, and lost some of its texture in the simplifying. But the basic fact of it stayed. Agnes Pratt did not get her property back. The criminal investigation complicated the question of restitution, and the legal process of recovering lost properties was slow and uncertain. She knew this going in. What she got instead was a formal acknowledgement in a state court document that her property had been taken from her through fraud, that her husband's 40 years of work had been stolen, not lost. It wasn't land, but it was the truth, in the specific permanent form that a court document has, and she told Celeste once that it mattered more to her than she'd expected. Pete Hargrove wrote a letter to his brother in Kansas. Celeste never knew what it said. Morrison's practice doubled in the year after the hearing. He acquired a junior associate, a young man from Denver, and expanded to a proper office on the main street, larger than the 2 rooms above the barber shop. He never said much to Celeste about what the case had meant to him personally, but he had a way of greeting her in town, a small nod that was specific to her, different from how he greeted other clients, and she understood it as one careful person's acknowledgement of another. Mercer Ranch in spring looked nothing like Mercer Ranch in the gray October when Celeste had arrived. The aspens came in pale green and shaking. The elk fence held. The south pasture drained early, and Rowan pronounced it a good omen, then said he didn't believe in omens, then continued looking pleased about the pasture. Maisie grew half an inch between November and April and was proud of it in the specific way of children who track their own development as evidence of something. She had started reading the books on Celeste's shelf, not just the primers, but the others, the histories and the collections of essays, pulling them down without asking permission and reading them in the window seat with her knees pulled up and her river stones lined up on the sill beside her. When Celeste noticed and said nothing, Maisie had looked at her with a testing expression, waiting for the objection that didn't come. After that, she read openly. There was an afternoon in April when Maisie was in the window seat with a book, and Rowan was outside, and Celeste was at the table with a different kind of paperwork. The papers for establishing a school, which she had been quietly working toward since December, a one-room building on the east edge of the ranch property, open to the children of families in the surrounding area who had no school within reasonable distance. She had written to the county education office and received a cautious response that was not a yes but was not a no, and she was working through the formal application. She looked up at Maisie in the window. Maisie was not reading. She was looking at Celeste. "What?" Celeste said. "Are you going to stay?" Maisie said. "Easy." Celeste set down her pen. She thought about the 2 rooms above the hardware store. She thought about a courthouse in October and a ring that had been slightly too large and was still slightly too large, but that she had stopped noticing most of the time. She thought about a lamp burning past midnight and a box of papers under a bed and a woman named Eleanor who had kept everything because she'd known the papers would matter. She thought about the specific truth that she had come to this ranch as a transaction and had stayed as something else, something that didn't have a clean name and didn't need one, something that had been built in the space between two people who had agreed not to diminish each other and had discovered that agreement was rare and more valuable than either of them had known. "Yes," she said, "I'm going to stay." Maisie nodded, with the gravity of a child confirming something she'd already decided. She went back to her book. Rowan came in from outside, bringing the smell of new grass and cold water with him, and looked at the table and at Maisie and the window and at Celeste, and he didn't say anything because he had become a person who knew when things didn't need to be said. He poured himself coffee. He sat across from Celeste at the table. He looked at the school application paper she was working on and said, "What do you need?" She told him. He listened. He asked practical questions: costs, materials, how many children, whether she needed someone to help with the building. His questions were the questions of a man who was asking because he intended to help, not because he intended to manage. She answered each one. Outside, the aspens were moving in the spring wind, their leaves not quite fully out, pale and bright and trembling. The east pasture was the color of new things. The cottonwood by the fence line, the big one, was coming into its own again after the winter. There are stories that end with the villain defeated and the property saved and the good people return to their rightful lives. And those endings are satisfying because they are fair, and fairness is one of the things people want most and receive least reliably from the world. This story has that ending. Crowley was convicted. The ranch was returned. The fraud was named and documented and placed in the permanent record. But the more honest ending, the one that took longer to arrive at and cost more to build, was this. Two people who had been used as instruments of someone else's scheme and had refused separately and then together to stay in the shape that scheme required. A man who had loved a woman he lost and learned, slowly and imperfectly, that love was not a thing that ran out. A woman who had spent 4 years being told her intelligence was inconvenient and had walked into a land she didn't know and burned lamps past midnight until the inconvenient intelligence was the only thing standing between a family and ruin. And a child who had set 3 places at the table on the first night without being asked, who had understood from the beginning what the adults around her were still working out. The school opened in September of the following year. 14 children on the first morning, ranging from 6 to 12, arriving on horseback and on foot from the surrounding ranches, their families standing at the fence line to watch with the careful hopefulness of people who had learned that good things didn't just appear, but could be built. Celeste stood at the door of the single room they had built together. Rowan and Del Wickies and Pete Hargrove's brother-in-law and 2 other men from the valley who had shown up on the building Saturday without being asked. And she looked at the 14 children filing in with their slates and their lunches and their river stones and their questions. She thought about a classroom she had been removed from 4 years ago because she had refused to be small. She thought, here is the room I should have had. Then she went inside and began.